Hey everyone, welcome back. Go ahead, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's take a slow walk through time. Tonight, we're not chasing kings or wars or the usual parade of royal egos. We're listening to the soft heartbeat of civilization itself. Because long before marble palaces and gold crowns, there was firelight. And around those first fires, humans learned two very important things: how to tell stories and how to believe in something bigger than themselves. Both of which, by the way, they've been overdoing ever since. Let's start with the early ones, the dreamers with dirt under their fingernails. The Mesopotamians, for example. They lived between two rivers that flooded unpredictably, the Tigris and Euphrates, and decided the best way to explain that chaos was to invent gods who were moody, temperamental, and constantly in need of attention, which, to be fair, still describes most rulers that came after them. They built ziggurats, massive step pyramids that reached for the heavens, not because anyone was going to climb them to visit the gods, but because height equals importance. It's a rule of architecture that's been followed religiously ever since. Each brick was a prayer, each offering a negotiation. They weren't trying to conquer the world, they were just trying to survive it, and maybe get some decent crops while they were at it. Now let's drift west, where the Nile moved slow and steady, like time itself had decided to take a nap. Egypt didn't have the unpredictable floods of Mesopotamia. Their river rose and fell with a kind of lazy rhythm, which gave them enough confidence to start thinking about eternity. And so they did. They built pyramids that still look smugly at the modern world, as if to say, we did this without Wi-Fi or cranes. Good luck topping it. Pharaohs declared themselves living gods, and everyone just sort of went along with it. Because if you're working 12 hours a day hauling limestone blocks in the heat, you don't have the energy to question divine authority. The Egyptians didn't fear death. They treated it like an elaborate road trip that required careful packing, food, furniture, pets, even servants, all prepared for the journey to the afterlife, which really shows their priorities, not eternal peace, but eternal logistics. Let's float a little further east now, to the Indus Valley, a civilization so organized that even their plumbing was better than most medieval kingdoms. They had grid streets, public baths, and actual drainage systems. Meanwhile, Europeans, centuries later, were still throwing chamber pots out of windows. But the Indus people were mysterious. No epic texts, no boastful inscriptions, no dramatic kings carving their names into mountains. Just clean streets, well-laid bricks, and quiet order. Maybe they figured out something the rest of us didn't. That you don't need to shout your greatness if your toilets already work. Then came China, the land of dynasties, dragons, and paperwork. Early emperors believed themselves chosen by heaven, a celestial job posting that apparently never expired. Every flood, every famine, every rebellion was a performance review from the cosmos. And when the review went badly, well, the dynasty fell. Still, they built walls long enough to be seen from space, bureaucracies so detailed that they'd make modern governments sweat, and philosophies that tried to explain everything from why stars move to why your neighbor is annoying. Confucius preached order. Lao Tzu said, maybe chill out instead. And somewhere between those two ideas, China found a rhythm that would last thousands of years. Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean, the Greeks were busy inventing philosophy, democracy, and public arguments. They loved questions more than answers, which is why they're still quoted in every freshman essay today. Their gods were dramatic, their politics chaotic, and their cities full of marble statues that were, let's say, idealized. It's easy to forget those bright white sculptures were once painted in loud, gaudy colors, the ancient world's version of over-the-top Instagram filters. And yes, they did invent democracy, but only for a small group of land-owning men. Everyone else got to watch. So technically, it was less rule by the people and more rule by the loudest dinner party guests. Still, their ideas about reason, beauty, and geometry reshaped the world. They even taught the Romans, who took those ideas, built aqueducts, and conquered just about everything that stood still long enough. The Romans were in many ways the overachievers of antiquity. They didn't just build cities, they franchised civilization. Roads, baths, law, architecture. If you wanted a brand new amphitheater with your local conquest, they were your guys. Their empire stretched so far and lasted so long that when it finally collapsed, half of Europe woke up confused for centuries. They called it the Dark Ages, which is a bit unfair. There was still light. It was just coming from candles instead of aqueducts. And in the ruins of Rome's marble dreams, people started building again. Smaller, humbler, but still dreaming upward. Because humanity has never known how to stop building things, even when it should probably take a break. Let's pause here. You can almost hear the echoes. Temples rising, drums beating, walls stretching across mountains. Every civilization thought it was permanent. Every one of them wanted to be remembered, and most of them eventually crumbled into dust. But dust, as it turns out, remembers everything. You just have to listen closely enough. So, take a slow breath. Let the images fade. The Nile's shimmer, the echo of chisel on stone, the hum of a Roman forum. Because next time, we're drifting into the darker corners of human belief, where fear, superstition, and dreams began shaping not just temples, but entire worlds.
Hey everyone, still here? Good. Keep that pillow fluffed and your breathing slow. We're going to drift further back, long before empires, before marble columns and royal tantrums, back when the world was mostly dark after sunset, and every flicker of fire felt like a miracle. Imagine this. Somewhere around 30,000 years ago, a few humans are sitting in a cave. Their fire crackles, shadows move across the walls, and someone, probably the tribe's best storyteller, or at least the most confident one, begins to speak. They don't have written words yet, no scrolls, no scripts, but they have memory and imagination. Two things that somehow built civilizations before we even figured out plumbing. These people looked at the night sky and didn't just see stars. They saw ancestors, gods, warnings, and sometimes, because humans have always been a little dramatic, omens of doom. They feared the dark because it felt alive. Everything unexplained was divine, or cursed, or both. Fast forward a few thousand years, and humans began building things that would outlast them. Stone circles in Britain, ziggurats in Mesopotamia, pyramids in Egypt, all different shapes but serving the same quiet need, to make the temporary feel eternal. Let's linger for a moment in ancient Egypt, because honestly, nobody understood the aesthetic of death quite like they did. The Egyptians didn't just believe in the afterlife, they designed for it. Tombs, temples, amulets, spells, all crafted to make sure one's spirit had a comfortable commute to the next world. Because heaven forbid you enter eternity without your favorite golden spoon. Pharaohs were seen as gods in human form. That sounds impressive, but in practice, it also meant your every headache or bad harvest was now divine drama. Imagine being told your migraine was a celestial sign. Sorry, Pharaoh, the Nile didn't flood. Must be your fault. And while the kings were busy being semi-immortal, the ordinary Egyptians were carving their names into pottery and walls, whispering prayers to cats, crocodiles, and, occasionally, onions. Yes, onions. The ancient Egyptians considered them sacred. The layers represented eternity, and they even placed onions in tombs. Somewhere out there, a mummy is eternally surrounded by the world's most tear-inducing offering. Let's float east for a moment toward Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, otherwise known as humanity's early experiment in chaos management. Here, cities like Ur and Babylon rose, complete with temples stacked like stairways to heaven. The gods lived on top floors, naturally. Priests handled the communication, which was probably convenient for the gods since humans already loved bureaucracy. And the people? Oh, they wrote. Oh, did they write? Cuneiform tablets, receipts, love letters, court rulings, beer recipes. Yes, beer. The oldest known recipe in human history isn't for bread or soup, it's for beer. Priorities, even then. The Mesopotamians believed in gods who were, well, moody. The kind who'd send floods if you annoyed them. You know, the divine equivalent of a bad roommate. And from these beliefs came one of humanity's first great stories, the Epic of Gilgamesh, a tale about kingship, friendship, immortality, and the humbling realization that even demigods can outrun death, which, in fairness, is quite the bedtime thought. Let's move a bit west again, across the Mediterranean, where the Greeks were about to make history very philosophical and occasionally scandalous. They built temples not just for worship, but for beauty. Columns, marble, geometry, all to please gods who were as flawed as their worshippers. Zeus couldn't keep a promise. Hera couldn't keep her temper. Dionysus couldn't keep his cup upright. And somehow, they ran the universe. But Greek society wasn't just about myths and melodrama. They thought deeply about life, or at least some of them did. Socrates questioned everything. Plato wrote about ideal forms. Aristotle categorized the world until he ran out of categories. And the rest of Athens probably just wished they'd stop asking questions during dinner. Meanwhile, in India, around the same time, people were crafting ideas that would echo across millennia. Concepts like karma, dharma, and rebirth, cosmic recycling basically, gave structure to existence. Life wasn't a single story, but a looping journey, with lessons tucked in every turn. And in China, harmony took center stage. Confucius spoke of order and respect, while Laozi whispered about balance and the flow of things, the Tao. It wasn't about conquering the world, but understanding it, gently. Across these lands, civilizations bloomed and decayed, but they shared a common heartbeat, a search for meaning in a world too vast to control. They prayed, built, and wrote, not because they fully understood life, but because they feared forgetting it. Let's drift back into the quiet now. The stars are still the same ones those early dreamers saw. The difference is we've traded fires for electric light and myths for algorithms. But deep down, we're still trying to explain the dark. And if you're still awake, congratulations! You've outlasted 5,000 years of human insomnia. Let's float gently into the next age, the one where kings wore crowns, faith built empires, and sleep became a luxury of the powerful.
Hey, still with me? Good. Let's sink a little deeper into the age where crowns glittered, faith burned bright, and everyone seemed convinced that power and piety were the same thing. Spoiler, they weren't, but it made for excellent gossip across the centuries. We've drifted from the quiet fires of early civilizations to the loud clang of kingdoms being forged, and in this next stretch of time, sleep was a rare luxury, not just for peasants, but for kings too, especially when your entire bloodline depended on producing an heir before your heart gave out or your cousin poisoned your soup. Let's begin in medieval Europe, that soft, candle-lit world where the rich slept under canopies and the poor slept wherever gravity allowed. Castles looked romantic, sure, but inside they were cold, smoky, and smelled faintly of damped armor and disappointment. The kings and queens of the Middle Ages lived in a strange mix of luxury and paranoia. The beds were large, not just for comfort,
but because everyone and their advisor shared them. Sleeping alone was considered weird. Even monarchs often shared their chambers with servants, guards, and sometimes visiting nobles. Imagine trying to sleep while someone sharpens a sword 3 feet from your pillow. Now let's talk about religion, because you can't stroll through medieval history without tripping over a monk. Faith wasn't a private matter then. It was a full-time job. Every action, every breath, every sneeze, all under divine surveillance. The church was the greatest power in Europe, a kind of celestial HR department that controlled your afterlife benefits. And while priests prayed and peasants plowed, popes played politics. Pope Gregory VII once excommunicated an emperor, Henry IV of the Holy Roman Empire, just to make a point. Henry, desperate to keep his crown, marched barefoot through snow to apologize. It worked, sort of. He got forgiveness, but also frostbite and humiliation. A very medieval combination. Speaking of royalty and regret, let's float over to France, where kings were divine, and often divinely absurd. Louis IX was so pious he went on 2 crusades and nearly bankrupted France in the process. Louis XIV, the Sun King, built Versailles because he decided Paris wasn't fabulous enough. He claimed to be the center of the universe, and honestly, given the mirrors in Versailles, he might have believed it. Versailles itself was a marvel. Gold, fountains, endless gardens, and 0 plumbing. The palace could host thousands of nobles, but lacked basic sanitation. The smell was historically immersive. Yet it became the stage for royal theater, a place where nobles competed not for power, but for proximity. Whoever got to hand the king his shirt in the morning held more influence than someone commanding an army. Power wasn't just about land. It was about access, and access was won by staying awake, staying visible, and staying favorably dull. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, things were just as dramatic. The Tudors, that royal soap opera of ambition, vanity, and really bad marriages, redefined monarchy. Henry VIII started as a handsome young king and ended as an angry man with gout, 3 dead wives, and a national church he invented because the Pope told him no. He made divine right sound more like divine spite. And then there was Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, or as her courtiers probably called her behind their back, the queen who outsmarted everyone. She ruled alone, never married, and somehow managed to keep her throne in a world that believed women couldn't even rule their own households. Elizabeth was sharp, calculating, and occasionally terrifying. The kind of leader who could smile sweetly while mentally plotting your downfall. Sleep for her was likely a luxury. After all, ruling a nation that wanted you married, dead, or both takes stamina. But it wasn't all kings, queens, and clergy. Ordinary people dreamed too. They dreamed of saints, angels, and the Virgin Mary, because dreams were thought to be divine messages. Nightmares, those were demons. The medieval mind had no shortage of supernatural customer service explanations. If you woke up with sleep paralysis, it wasn't anxiety, it was a night hag sitting on your chest. A comforting thought before bedtime, truly. Let's wander east now, to the Byzantine Empire, where emperors wore crowns heavy enough to cause migraines and court intrigue could make Shakespeare blush. The Byzantines were obsessed with ceremony. Every movement of the emperor, every robe color, every audience, scripted to perfection. Their capital, Constantinople, was the jewel of the world, and occasionally its gossip hub. Byzantine politics made modern reality TV look tame. Eunuchs, empresses, generals, all playing chess with lives and thrones. One empress, Theodora, rose from being a performer, possibly an actress, possibly something less family-friendly, to co-ruling the empire with Justinian. She was sharp, cunning, and terrifyingly competent. When riots threatened the throne, Justinian considered fleeing. Theodora told him calmly that royal purple made the best burial shroud. He stayed, she ruled, and history took notes. But let's pause here for a breath. Across centuries, from kings to peasants, popes to philosophers, humanity's obsession with meaning, power, and reputation never really changed. They built monuments, cathedrals, and empires, not just to live, but to be remembered. Because deep down, everyone feared the same thing, that someday their story would fade into silence. The candles flicker lower, the feasts are done. The kings, queens, and clergy all drift slowly into the same quiet sleep that we do. Their dreams, like ours, were full of what-ifs and unfinished plans. So, let's move softly now into another age, one filled with discovery, art, and the uneasy hum of a world beginning to question its gods and kings.
Hey there, still awake? That's okay. Tonight's journey isn't meant to rush. We're gliding now into the Renaissance, that shiny period everyone romanticizes, where Europe supposedly woke up from the Dark Ages and decided art, science, and the human body were suddenly fascinating again. Of course, not everyone was painting or inventing. Most people were still just trying not to starve. But history remembers the ones who could afford marble and leisure, and they made sure of it. The Renaissance began quietly in Italy around the 14th century. Florence, to be exact, a city so wealthy it basically ran on art, trade, and family drama. And at the center of that drama was the Medici family. Bankers, patrons, and all-around professional puppet masters. They sponsored artists, built cathedrals, and occasionally bribed popes, which back then was just called networking. Cosimo de' Medici practically invented the concept of being rich enough to buy respect. He funded Brunelleschi's dome, Donatello's statues, and the general illusion that Florence was a cultural utopia. In reality, the city was a swirling mix of genius, gossip, and plague. But art thrived anyway, because what else are humans going to do when faced with mortality other than make things beautiful? Let's float over to Leonardo da Vinci, everyone's favorite Renaissance overachiever. Painter, sculptor, inventor, occasional procrastinator. Leonardo filled notebooks with sketches of flying machines, anatomical studies, and grocery lists, all written backwards, because apparently even his handwriting had to be mysterious. He painted the Mona Lisa, that small, unassuming portrait that somehow became the world's most famous smirk. People have spent centuries debating her smile, whether it's amused, sad, or just mildly judging us. Leonardo would probably be pleased. He loved an enigma. But life wasn't easy for the genius crowd. Michelangelo, for example, spent years painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling, lying on scaffolding, paint dripping into his eyes, muttering poetry about how much he hated it. The result? One of humanity's greatest masterpieces. So basically, history's longest and most miserable DIY project. And while the artists were busy suffering beautifully, Europe's scholars were quietly rewriting how people understood the world. Copernicus suggested that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe, which was, at the time, a bold way to make enemies with both church and ego. Galileo later backed him up, using his telescope to confirm what everyone feared. We weren't special. He got placed under house arrest for saying so, which, in Renaissance terms, was the intellectual equivalent of a timeout. Meanwhile, monarchs continued doing what monarchs do best, building palaces and pretending divine authority. Take Henry VIII again. Yes, he's back, because apparently the man couldn't stay out of history's spotlight. During the Renaissance, Henry became the poster child for royal rebranding. He ditched Rome, founded the Church of England, and married enough women to qualify as a one-man marital disaster series. But Renaissance England wasn't all drama and divorce. It was also the era of William Shakespeare, a man who wrote plays so full of love, betrayal, and existential dread that they've kept theater students awake for centuries. Shakespeare understood people, maybe too well. His kings were flawed, his lovers impulsive, and his clowns wise. And somehow he made iambic pentameter sound like normal conversation. While Europe obsessed over art and ideas, the rest of the world wasn't exactly sitting still. In the Islamic world, cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Istanbul had already been centers of learning for centuries. They preserved ancient Greek texts, invented algebra, perfected surgery, and made maps that actually worked. The so-called Renaissance in Europe was in many ways just a very delayed thank you note to them. And in China, the Ming Dynasty was crafting porcelain so fine it became a global obsession. Explorers like Zheng He commanded fleets larger than anything Europe could dream of, sailing across the Indian Ocean decades before Columbus got lost. But history, being written by the West, often forgot those stories. Funny how selective memory can be, even in the Age of Enlightenment. Let's drift now to the explorers, the sleep-deprived sailors who thought the world was smaller than it was. Columbus stumbled onto the Americas in 1492, insisting he'd found India. He didn't, but he did find new lands to exploit, new people to misunderstand, and new diseases to spread. It was, by every measure, a tragic turning point disguised as progress. The so-called Age of Discovery was less about discovery and more about expansion of wealth, empires, and egos. Portugal, Spain, and later England and France carved the world like a feast they hadn't been invited to. For the people on the receiving end, indigenous cultures across the Americas, Africa, and Asia, it was the beginning of centuries of loss and resistance. But those stories, too, deserve their quiet space in history's night. Through all this, sleep, that small, universal comfort, remained unchanged. Peasants still huddled near fires, kings still tossed in canopied beds. Dreams carried the same fears and longings, no matter the size of the pillow. As the Renaissance faded, so did its idealism. The candles of discovery burned bright, but left long shadows. And soon, those shadows stretched into the cold, logical dawn of reason, a time when faith gave way to facts, and humanity began asking questions even God couldn't comfortably answer. So, let's close this chapter softly, with marble dust in the air, the echo of church bells, and the faint scent of oil paint drying in dimly lit studios. Tomorrow, we'll wander into the Age of Reason and see what happens when humans try to explain the universe and accidentally invent anxiety instead.
Hey there, still with me? If so, congratulations, you've officially made it past the plagues, the popes, and the painters. Now, let's drift gently into the 17th and 18th centuries, the so-called Age of Reason. It was an era that promised logic, science, and progress, which of course meant an impressive new collection of mistakes dressed as enlightenment. Let's start with the thinkers. This was the age of philosophers, men who spent their days sitting in cold rooms writing about human nature while probably forgetting to eat. Descartes declared, "I think, therefore I am," which is a poetic way of saying he overthought things professionally. Then there was Voltaire, who basically turned sarcasm into a weapon. He mocked the church, kings, and anyone else who confused power with intelligence, which was, to be fair, most people in power. And Isaac Newton, the quiet genius who discovered gravity by watching an apple fall. Or, as more skeptical historians suggest, by simply having a moment of extreme observation and boredom. Newton also invented calculus in his free time, because apparently he wasn't stressed enough. He saw the universe as a great machine, predictable, measurable, and orderly. It's kinda sweet, really. He had no idea what quantum physics was going to do to that optimism later. Science began replacing superstition, but only for some. While gentlemen in powdered wigs were calculating orbits, regular folks were still tossing salt over their shoulders and blaming witches for bad harvests. Progress, as always, was unevenly distributed. And yet, this was the beginning of something remarkable. The idea that humans could understand nature without divine permission. Telescopes, microscopes, and mathematics revealed a world far stranger and more beautiful than any myth. Galaxies stretched endlessly. Blood cells danced under lenses. The universe became vast, but strangely familiar. Of course, reason didn't necessarily make people reasonable. This was also the age of empire, when European nations, now armed with science and self-confidence, decided to catalog and conquer everything they could find. The same minds that mapped the stars also mapped colonies, often with a ruler in one hand and a rifle in the other. England, France, Spain, and the Netherlands raced to claim continents, calling it exploration while it was mostly exploitation. They brought back spices, gold, and diseases, along with a sense of divine entitlement that could fuel an empire for centuries. It was the age of the ship, sleek, fast, and often filled with stolen things. And where there were ships, there was trade. Where there was trade, there was slavery. Millions of lives uprooted, sold, and erased from their own histories, all justified under the same logic that praised human progress. It's one of history's cruelest paradoxes, the Enlightenment, that bright era of reason, running parallel to one of humanity's darkest moral failures. But let's step back for a moment and drift to the salons of Paris, where powdered philosophers debated over tea. They talked about liberty, equality, and natural rights, noble ideas mostly ignored by the people who wrote them. Rousseau said society corrupted man, which was easy to say when your biggest problem was an overbooked dinner party. Meanwhile, commoners were wondering when bread became more expensive than life. And then came 1789, when France, after centuries of monarchy, finally exploded. The French Revolution wasn't quiet or elegant or particularly rational, but it was inevitable. People had had enough of powdered wigs eating cake while everyone else starved. Louis XVI tried to fix things by being indecisive, which worked about as well as you'd expect. Marie Antoinette became the face of royal excess, mostly because she was visible, foreign, and convenient to blame. And the guillotine, oh, the guillotine, that symbol of equality, cutting down nobles and peasants alike with the calm efficiency of an idea gone too far. But history has a way of balancing itself. Out of the chaos came Napoleon, short, ambitious, and perpetually in need of validation. He crowned himself emperor, because apparently waiting for someone else to do it was too humble. For a man who claimed to spread liberty, he sure enjoyed invading people. Still, he left behind a Europe permanently changed, modernized, bureaucratic, and suspicious of short men with big dreams. Across the Atlantic, another revolution was brewing, the American one. A group of British colonists, tired of taxes and tea drama, decided to invent a country. The United States was born in 1776, armed with Enlightenment ideals and, somewhat ironically, slavery. Its founding fathers were a fascinating mix of brilliance and hypocrisy, philosophers and Whigs who wrote about freedom while owning people. Still, their experiment in self-government became one of history's loudest echoes. Back in Europe, the Enlightenment kept humming along. Coffee houses buzzed with debates about reason and reform. Scientists kept dissecting frogs, charting stars, and inventing new ways to measure things. It was a time of order, curiosity, and questionable fashion choices. Men wore corsets. Women were wigs tall enough to require their own ecosystem. Vanity, it seems, was immune to progress. As the 18th century dimmed, something new flickered to life: the Industrial Revolution. The hum of machines replaced the chatter of salons. Factories rose where fields once stood. Steam became the heartbeat of civilization, and with it came smoke, soot, and sleeplessness. Humanity had mastered fire once. Now it mastered power, and in doing so began reshaping the very planet beneath its feet. Cities swelled, skies darkened, children worked. The world, once vast and wild, began to shrink under the weight of gears and ambition. But we'll let that story unfold slowly, in the soft glow of lamplight, amid the hum of turning wheels. Because as humans built faster, brighter worlds, something inside them began to fade. The quiet, the mystery, the connection to night and dream. So take a deep breath. Let the Enlightenment flicker out for now, with its powdered philosophers, idealistic revolutions, and echoing contradictions. We'll pick up next time as the smoke rises into the age of iron, industry, and insomnia.
Hey again, still awake? Or maybe half asleep, which is exactly the right state for this part. Because tonight we drift into the 19th century, a time when humanity decided it was done with candles, horses, and patience. Welcome to the Industrial Revolution, the era when the world traded dreams for deadlines. Let's start with the obvious: smoke. The sky turned gray, the air thickened, and cities began to hum like giant, overworked machines. England led the charge, because of course it did. Nothing says progress like covering an entire island in coal dust. Factories sprouted like mushrooms after rain, only with more screaming and fewer mushrooms. The spinning jenny, the steam engine, and the cotton gin, all marvels of invention, all symbols of a world that had decided to never rest again. For the first time in history, time itself became a business expense. Clocks appeared in factories, streets, even in people's pockets. Tick-tocking reminders that every second could be monetized. Workers became extensions of machines. Children worked 12-hour shifts. Men coughed black dust. Women balanced impossible lives in the shadows of chimneys. Progress, apparently, wasn't free. Cities swelled to bursting. London, Manchester, Birmingham, places where innovation met misery and decided to move in together. Soot covered everything, including the optimism of the Enlightenment. People dreamed less about philosophy and more about getting a day off. But still, the gears kept turning. And yet, in this gray world of industry, something quietly beautiful emerged: light. Electricity began to shimmer at the edges of darkness. Thomas Edison tinkered in his workshop, probably muttering about how sleep was for less ambitious people. When he lit up a bulb, the world gasped, and then immediately began staying up later. Night lost its mystery. It just became more time to work. Steamships crossed oceans, railways sliced through continents. The world that once felt endless now folded into timetables and trade routes. A letter that once took months could travel in days. And yet, loneliness didn't shrink. It just industrialized. Factories brought wealth, but also anxiety. Cities grew, but so did poverty. For every aristocrat collecting profits, there were hundreds of workers collecting blisters. Writers like Charles Dickens tried to point it out, describing soot-stained children and starving clerks, but progress had no off switch. Meanwhile, the aristocracy pretended nothing had changed. They built bigger houses, wore more lace, and talked about progress as if they personally invented it. Queen Victoria reigned through it all, somehow becoming the face of both discipline and dullness. Her empire stretched across the globe, her subjects numbering in the millions, none of whom she personally knew or probably cared much about. But let's pause there, because while Europe was puffing smoke and exporting empire, something strange was happening to the human spirit. Romanticism, the great artistic rebellion against machines and math. Poets fled to mountains to write about nature and emotions, mostly heartbreak and clouds. Painters chased sunsets instead of prophets. Musicians wrote symphonies that sounded like longing itself. It was humanity's sigh against the gears. The Romantic poets, bless them, were beautifully dramatic. Lord Byron swam lakes, broke hearts, and died young, the trifecta of poetic branding. Shelley wrote about revolution and drowned. Keats wrote about beauty and coughed himself to death. Apparently, tuberculosis was a creative muse in the 19th century. And then came the Victorians, moralistic, repressed, and absolutely obsessed with etiquette. They built railways and telegraphs while pretending not to think about desire. Every invention seemed to have a matching moral panic. Trains were too fast, novels were too emotional, women reading them, practically anarchy. Underneath all that lace and discipline, people were quietly terrified of change, of science, of themselves. Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859 and suggested that maybe, just maybe, humans weren't divine masterpieces, but rather ambitious apes. Society gasped, and then immediately argued about it for the next century. The church panicked, the scientists cheered, the general public mostly wondered what it meant for dinner conversations. The 19th century was a paradox. It invented comfort and destroyed rest. Beds were softer, lamps were brighter, books were cheaper, and yet nobody seemed to relax. Cities buzzed, factories clanged, and the once mystical night became a playground for insomnia. People began measuring success not in peace, but in productivity. The industrial age made humanity richer, louder, and infinitely more tired. But even amidst all that noise, there were whispers of wonder. Steam engines thundered across landscapes that poets once described as eternal. And yet, there was beauty in their motion. The click of typewriters, the hum of electricity, the glow of gas lamps on rain-slicked cobblestones. It was a new kind of poetry, one made of metal and movement. By the century's end, the world had changed beyond recognition. Empires spanned continents, machines ruled industries. The dreamers, artists, and thinkers stood at the edge of a new century, unsure whether they'd built a paradise or a cage. And as the first light bulbs flickered in cities that never slept, humanity stepped quietly into the modern world, blinking, coughing, and still hoping for meaning in the machinery. So, if you're still awake, maybe let the hum of progress fade into the background for a while. Because next, we drift into the 20th century, an age of speed, war, electricity, and endless dreams disguised as nightmares.
Hey there, still with me? You've survived medieval nights, Renaissance success, and the smoky industrial grind. Now, let's take a slow breath and float into the 20th century, a time when humans finally learned how to stay awake forever and called it modernity. The new century arrived like a caffeine rush. Electric lights burned through the darkness, cities glowed like constellations made of ambition, and people believed the future was theirs to invent. Sleep, poor old sleep, suddenly felt outdated. Who needed dreams when you could build airplanes, jazz bands, and atomic bombs? Let's start gently with optimism. The early 1900s were full of it. Art Nouveau curled across Europe like vines of glass and gold. People believed in progress, in beauty, in human genius. Paris glittered. New York climbed upward. Vienna sang. And somewhere, Sigmund Freud was taking notes about everyone's mother. Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, believed that dreams were windows into the unconscious, the mind's late-night gossip session. People suddenly became fascinated with what they dreamed, what they feared, and what that all meant. It was the golden age of couches and confessions. And honestly, it made sense. After all, the world was changing too fast to process while awake. Then came the noise. War. The First World War arrived in 1914, dragging with it the death of empires and the birth of disillusionment. Men marched into mud with dreams of glory and came back shattered, if they came back at all. The trenches were endless, damp labyrinths of fear, boredom, and whispers of home. Night, once a comfort, became something terrifying, filled with flares, gas, and silence too heavy to bear. When it was over, the world didn't sleep, it danced instead. The 1920s, the Jazz Age, a decade of defiance, speakeasies, flappers, cocktails, and saxophones. People drank, laughed, and danced, trying to drown the echoes of the war. Electric light became a symbol of survival, as if keeping the darkness away might keep the memories at bay too. But of course, the party couldn't last. 1929 brought the Great Depression, and the glitter dimmed. Factories closed, banks collapsed, and bread lines stretched across the cities. People who once dreamed of wealth now dreamed simply of dinner. Sleep became an escape again, the cheapest therapy there was. And while humanity tried to recover, the world quietly prepared for another disaster. The Second World War made the first look like a rehearsal. Cities bombed, nations burned, and nights lit up not with stars, but with explosions. Air raid sirens replaced lullabies. People slept underground, in bunkers and basements, praying the morning would still arrive. Yet even in that chaos, the human imagination refused to die. Writers scribbled by candlelight. Soldiers wrote poems in trenches. Mothers whispered stories to their children in the dark. Hope, fragile but stubborn, kept breathing. When the war finally ended in 1945, the world didn't rest. It rebuilt. Technology exploded. Radios turned into televisions. Airplanes turned into jetliners. And soon, someone decided to strap a rocket to a dream and send it into space. The space age, a new kind of wonder. Humans, for the first time, looked back at Earth from above and realized how small, how fragile, and how utterly beautiful it was. Astronauts spoke of silence, real silence, out there. No hum of machines, no noise of cities, just a vast, eternal quiet. It was, ironically, the best sleep metaphor ever. Meanwhile, back on Earth, modern life got louder. The 1950s brought consumerism and conformity, shiny kitchens, smiling families, and enough caffeine to power a small nation. The 1960s rebelled. Color, chaos, music, protest. Dreams became psychedelic, literally. The counterculture wanted peace, love, and maybe 8 hours of sleep, but mostly peace. By the 1970s, the world was exhausted again. Disco lights flickered, oil ran out, and people started staring at themselves in mirrors and wondering what all this progress had really bought them. And then came screens. First, television, then computers, little glowing boxes that began to colonize human attention. Sleep had a new rival. The late 20th century was obsessed with speed. Information, travel, production, everything accelerated. We invented the internet, and with it, insomnia 2.0. People started scrolling through lives instead of living them. The hum of electricity became the lullaby of civilization. And somewhere, someone was already asking the question we still whisper today. If we can stay awake forever, should we? Because that's what the century became, a dreamless race towards connection. Phones, screens, constant light, the modern miracle that turned every night into a fluorescent twilight. Humans became half-awake creatures chasing signals in the dark. And the tragedy? We forgot how to rest. Yet amid the chaos, there were always quiet dreamers, writers, philosophers, even scientists who whispered reminders that stillness is sacred. Carl Jung spoke of collective dreams, connecting humanity in symbols and archetypes. Alan Watts mused about the illusion of control, about how sleep might be life's practice for letting go. And artists painted, sang, and filmed reminders of our need to pause, to breathe. So, here we are, at the end of a century that conquered night itself. We can light up the sky, map our dreams, and talk across oceans instantly. But the simplest miracle, closing our eyes and surrendering, has never felt more endangered. As the hum of the modern world fades into the background, think about it. Humans began history by fearing the dark, and now we fear silence. Maybe progress isn't about staying awake. Maybe it's about remembering how to dream.